Can a house catch leprosy? Depending on your Bible translation, it might seem like the answer is yes. The King James Version says, if the plague has spread in the house, it is an active leprosy. A leprous house? Today, we're going to focus on just one word, leprosy. And as we look at just 2 chapters in Leviticus, we're going to discover something unexpected. Leprosy can affect a house, a human, and a garment, which means whatever this word describes is certainly more than a skin disease. What we'll see is that leprosy is not defined by its name, but by its behavior. And it gets in deep under the surface, and it spreads. There's a reason why Jesus cleanses a man with leprosy immediately after giving the Sermon on the Mount. But we'd never notice it, let alone make sense of it, unless we first understand how leprosy connects a piece of clothing, a house, and a human. Today, for a change, I'm going to prefer the King James Version, because today, the King James Version is better. But, and don't cancel me, the King James Version gets this one word wrong. But the King James Version is consistent, and in this case, consistency matters. Being consistent with this word makes all the difference. The word we're reading in English is leprosy, but leprosy is the wrong word for at least 2 reasons, probably 3 reasons, and I'll let you know what they are in a minute or 2. But first, what is the English word leprosy? What is the English word leprosy, and how did it get into our Bibles? Today, leprosy refers to a specific disease called Hansen's disease. So in the 19th century, after the bacterium was identified, the word became fixed as a specific medical diagnosis. But before that, in medieval Europe, leprosy was a term for any kind of visible skin disorder. Leprosy came into English from the Latin lepra, which means scaly, and that came from the Greek word, which means to peel. So by the time the King James Version came out in the 1600s, leprosy just meant a scaly skin or a peeling skin condition. And that's the problem. The Hebrew word underneath all this does not map neatly onto any English word or Latin or Greek. The Hebrew word is tzara'at. And as you read the instructions for how to identify tzara'at, you'll realize that what Leviticus is describing is definitely not Hansen's disease. Sorry, King James Version, but tzara'at is not leprosy. If tzara'at isn't leprosy, what is it? To answer that, we'll have to notice what a house, a human, and a garment have in common. Because according to Leviticus chapters 13 to 14, tzara'at affects all these things. The last 3 words of chapter 14 provide a summary of the previous 2 chapters. 3 Hebrew words. Zot, Torah, tzara'at. Zot, that's this or this is. Torah, that's the law, or better, the teaching. And tzara'at. So that means basically this, the law of leprosy. Or as the King James Version says, this is the law of leprosy. And according to the King James Version, leprosy affects, like we've said, human skin, clothing, and the walls of a house. And that's why translating the same word consistently is important, because Torah means teaching. And here, Leviticus just summarized the last 2 chapters, chapters 13 and 14, as one Torah, singular. So whatever tzara'at is, it can't be separated into categories. What affects a house is related to what affects a garment. And what affects a garment is related to what affects a human. Together, they provide one Torah, one teaching, one unified instruction. So what is tzara'at? The NIV translates those 3 words like this. Leviticus 14:57 in the NIV, These are the regulations for defiling skin diseases and defiling molds. First up, these are the instructions. The NIV has said these as though there's more than one law. And that's a bit misleading because the Hebrew is specific. One law, one Torah, one teaching, and one word, tzara'at, the law of leprosy. But what else did we see? According to the NIV, tzara'at might be a skin disease or mold. Why don't we see how some other Bible translations translate those three Hebrew words? The CSB says this is the law regarding skin disease and mildew. And the Net Bible says this is a law for dealing with infectious disease. As you read through chapters 13 to 14, you'll notice tzara'at can appear on someone's skin, on their bald head. It can appear in someone's clothes or in leather. And tzara'at can appear in the walls of a house. And depending on your Bible translation, you might read about mildew or mold or defiling disease or skin disease or infectious skin disease, defiling mold or diseased infection. So could we be maybe thinking about an infection or a fungus? Here we need to be careful because Leviticus doesn't define tzara'at medically. The Bible diagnoses leprosy based on its behavior, whether it spreads or goes deeper. Okay, let's dig deeper. Ha! I see what you did there. Dig deeper. In chapter 13, the priest is instructed to inspect various conditions on someone's skin, from a sore on the skin or swelling, a rash, a shiny spot or a mark, or as the King James Version says, a plague on the skin. Leviticus 13:15 says, when the priest sees the raw flesh, he shall pronounce him unclean. The raw flesh is unclean, it is tzara'at. In verse 51, the priest inspects a garment, and if the mark or the plague or the mold has spread, it is unclean. It is tzara'at. Or as the King James Version says, it is a plague of leprosy. And again, the King James kicks another goal here. While other translations talk about leather, the King James sticks with skin, which is more consistent, again, because in Hebrew, leather is skin. And this consistency shows us that tzara'at affects both human skin and leather skins. Okay, a house. In chapter 14, verse 35, we read, the owner of the house must go and tell the priest, I have seen something that looks like leprosy in my house. Have a read of verse 35 in different translations because it's pretty funny. The RSV says, there seems to be some sort of disease in my house. Or the NIV, I have seen something that looks like defiling mold in my house. Or the King James, it seemeth to me there is, as it were, a plague in the house. Or the CSB, something like mildew contamination has appeared in my house. So far, we've seen lots of words. Mildew, mold, disease, plague, and they affect various surfaces. Skin, fabric, house bricks. And all of that is summarized as Zot Torah tzara'at. How's my Hebrew? The Torah, the teaching of tzara'at, leprosy. So what is the teaching? What's the teaching, Phil? Chapter 13, verse 34 says, the priest is to examine the itch or the scale or the sore on a person's skin. And if it is not spread in the skin and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean. This is the key. The priest is checking whether it has gotten under the skin, whether it's deeper than the surface, and whether it's spread. If it hasn't, he's clean. If it has, it's tzara'at. Presumably, when this Torah was given, The Israelites were still in the wilderness. They were still living in tents. And so when chapter 14 says, when you enter the land, you will be living in houses. And in verse 34, God says, when I put leprosy into the bricks of your house. And again, different Bibles might have, instead of leprosy, a mark of leprosy or mildew. But what we're going to see is the same pattern. The priest examines the wall of the house, and if the mark appears to be deeper than the wall, it's unclean. So the priest shuts up the house and comes back after 7 days and again inspects, and this time, if the mold has spread on the walls, he diagnoses it as tzara'at. It is unclean. The same process with fabric or a piece of material. The priest inspects a garment or fabric, and depending on your translation, he's looking at mold or the mark or the contamination or the plague. And again, he's checking to see if it's spread. Same thing. If it's spread, the priest pronounces it as tzara'at. I learnt 2 new words as I was reading these verses, as I was researching this. In verse 53, there's 2 words that I had to look up in a dictionary. Warp and woof. These 2 words describe the 2 sets of threads, how 2 sets of threads are woven together. Warp is the thread going lengthways. I think it's warp, could be warp, the thread that goes up and down. And woof, I think it's woof, could be woof, that's the thread that goes across. So if the plague has got into the warp and the woof, it's not on the surface anymore. It's not just a surface problem. It's got in deep, into the very fabric of the garment. And here, I think, is where we begin to see what this might be teaching Israel, the Torah of tzara'at. Remember that Torah isn't like law in a Western judicial or legal system. Torah in Hebrew contains wisdom. Knowing Torah and keeping Torah communicates and teaches and molds the Israelites into wise and righteous people. Molds the Israelites? Keeping Torah is wisdom training. Now, when reading scripture, especially the Old Testament, I don't think it's wise to always look for allegory. I don't think that David defeating Goliath is to teach us to battle our giants. And I'm definitely not saying that a skin disease or having mildew in your pajamas is a sin. Being unclean in the Old and the New Testament wasn't a sin. But what I am saying is Torah trained Israel to recognize patterns. And maybe that pattern helped Israel identify something that could become problematic, that could become sinful. A person was unclean after coming into contact with a dead body. Same with not eating ravens or eagles. There's nothing inherently wrong with them as birds, but they feed on death, on dead animals. So they're unclean. And I think these kinds of laws were to train the Israelites to understand that death doesn't belong, and death will not belong in God's kingdom. With that said, what I'm about to say, you could accuse me of allegorizing, but sometimes you just have to follow the thread. And this thread led me to something pretty incredible. Follow the thread. Stop. That's enough. Basically, while a rash or a plague was on the surface, it was fine. It was clean. But it needed to be monitored. Then, once it spread, it was then diagnosed as tzara'at. Or once it went deeper than the surface, then it became tzara'at, or leprosy. In chapter 13, verse 28, it says, if the spot remains in its place and has not spread, the priest shall pronounce him clean. But, verse 27, if it spreads on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is tzara'at. Or verse 30, the priest shall look, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is tzara'at. But, verse 3, if the priest looks and it has not spread on the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. Same with a garment or leather. If it's on the surface and it hasn't spread, clean. But the moment it spreads, or if it gets into the warp and the woof, unclean. And a house, while it's on the surface, clean. But if it spreads, verse 39 says, but if it has spread, or if it's deeper than the surface, that's verse 37, it has to be torn out. The bricks have to be pulled out and thrown away. It is tzara'at. I wonder if the Torah of tzara'at, this teaching, was training the Israelites to realize that impurity is easy to deal with if it's only a surface level. But if it gets deeper, if it gets into the very fabric of the garment, or inside the walls of the house, or under the skin, it's hard to get out. Maybe impossible to get out. Maybe the garment needs to be burned, and that's the instruction in chapter 13. Or maybe the bricks need to be torn out and thrown away, and that is the instruction in chapter 14. Perhaps this is why yeast is associated with sin in the Bible, because once yeast is in there, it spreads and you can't remove it. Jesus touched a man with leprosy, but Jesus didn't become unclean. Why not? Okay, the Levite priest never heals tzara'at. He examines, he inspects, he diagnoses clean or unclean, and then he quarantines. But when Jesus encounters tzara'at in the Gospels, he touches and he heals. Hey, don't let anyone tell you that Leviticus is boring. We've just spent the last little while looking at one word in 2 chapters of Leviticus. And Leviticus is about to reveal something about Jesus. Jesus didn't catch leprosy because the main issue wasn't about a contagious skin disease. It was, I think, about whether the impurity had gotten under the skin. In Leviticus, impurity becomes problematic when it goes deeper. But in Jesus, purity runs deeper. The contamination doesn't spread to Jesus. Instead, Jesus' purity spreads out to those around him. When a woman who had been bleeding touches Jesus, she doesn't make him unclean. Rather, his holiness makes her clean and heals her. And when Jesus touches a man with leprosy, rather than Jesus becoming impure, Jesus' purity heals the man. That in itself is amazing. A Levite priest couldn't heal. He just pronounced clean or unclean. But Jesus heals the problem, the cause of impurity. He gets to the root source of the problem. With just a touch, Jesus healed and cleansed. But there's more. And I wasn't expecting this at all. When I started studying these 2 chapters, I started to dig a bit deeper, and I had no idea that it would reveal something about the Sermon on the Mount. Dig deeper? Good one, Phil. When does Jesus heal a man with leprosy? Immediately after presenting the Sermon on the Mount. It's literally the first thing that happens. Matthew 8, verse 1 says, "When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him, and a man with leprosy came to him and bowed down before him and said, 'Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean.'" Could Jesus cleansing the leper be illustrating what he'd just taught them on the mountain? I don't think it's a coincidence. I think when Matthew wrote his gospel, he was very, very intentional. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus moves impurity from external behavior to internal depth. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the Torah. I have come to fulfill it." And then he lists some of them, some of the Torah, some of the laws. He says, "You've heard it said, don't murder." Murder is the outward sign that reveals a deeper corruption. Murder is the result of an impurity, a corruption that has got into the fabric of someone's soul, into the very fiber of their being. Jesus says, you've heard it said, don't murder. But I tell you that anyone who hates his brother, or anyone who says, you fool, is on their way to the fires of Gehenna. Why? Maybe because if the hate has got in deep, its roots are well beneath the skin, and like a garment infected with leprosy, the only way to deal with it was to burn it. Again, later Jesus says, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. We know that by the time someone has committed adultery, something has been festering under the surface for a long time, corrupting the soul. And I think that's why Jesus says, but I tell you, anyone who even looks with lust, that's where it starts, on the surface. It might seem harmless. It's only a look. It's only looking. But keep looking and the lust will sink its teeth in. Still in the Sermon on the Mount, and what does Jesus recommend? He says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. Apparently, like removing impure bricks from a house, it's easier to remove an eye than a lust that has gotten inside you and dug its claws in. Okay, to finish up, I'll just finish the story from Matthew. Jesus comes down the mountain and he encounters a man who was probably calling out, unclean, unclean. And Jesus heads straight towards him. From verse 3, it says, Jesus reached out with his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go, show yourself to the priest and present the offering for your cleansing, just as Moses commanded as a testimony to them.